So if everyone is set, we're going to start with our first session on post and decolonial conceptual trajectories. So we have throughout the day, as you've seen in the program, but for those of you who haven't skimmed it, a couple of sessions where we have our international guests coming, providing some short inputs for this session. It's going to be roughly 10 minutes each. I'll let them have their inputs. I also have prepared some notes by Sabelo Nogaceni, who cannot be with us today, but sent a concept note beforehand, which I circulated also within the network. So I'll be briefly summarizing that, and then we can open up the discussion. And also very eager to hear your thoughts on the questions that we're discussing. So we have like some guiding questions in the program about how to define and translate postcoloniality and decoloniality, about the differences and points of divergences of those concepts, so sort of getting a little bit clearer of the terminology that we're actually also using in the research project. And then, of course, strength, importances, importance, pitfalls, weaknesses, critiques of the terminologies. So also engaging them both in a more pragmatic sense and a more critical sense. So these are just like some guidelines of the questions that we'll be discussing now, and I'm also very excited to see the inputs that our guests have prepared today. So first I'd like to introduce Madina Tlostanova, I hope I did that right, who is at Linköping University, a professor of postcolonial feminism, and has prepared an input on decoloniality versus postcolonial studies, intersections and divergences. And I'll give you the word for that.
Oh, okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. That was quick. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm really feeling honored and very curious to learn more new things during these intense 2 days. And of course, you realize it's very difficult to say anything relevant in 10 minutes, but I will try. Maybe in bullet points or something. Yeah, I mean, I've been part of the International Decolonial Collective for more than 20 years, and many of you know, I'm sure, that decoloniality is very often opposed to post-colonial studies or post-colonial theory, right? And we don't call ourselves theory or studies for a reason, because we think that since we are decolonizing thinking and decolonizing universities, or attempting to, right? And epistemological grounds of modernity/coloniality, then of course to use the word studies would be strange, because studies presupposes that you are already posing yourself and putting yourself in a situation of a subject, as opposed to the objectified whatever you're studying, the world, other people, you know, other groups. So no studies for us. That's why we use the word decoloniality instead of decolonial studies. And so whenever you see that somebody calls the Department of Decolonial Studies, it shows they don't understand what decoloniality is about. So that is one thing. And postcolonial, as you, of course, most of you know, yes, it emerges first with the British Empire, and so it still has these traces of connection to the British Empire. And then a little bit later with French, and whenever today we read something about it, it still kind of starts and departs from the historical geopolitical situation of the British Empire and its aftermath. While decoloniality, again, as you know, I mean, I'm repeating basic things here, emerges in Latin America, and it tries to bring into the picture the forgotten or erased or downplayed history of the colonization of the New World, so to say, right, and what comes after. And again, I mean, it's not ideal, it's not universal, it starts with its own specific situation and assumes that the situation is more or less global. Well, I think it is, it maybe answers more questions, because it questions, as I said, epistemological grounds of modernity, rather than being just a descriptive tool to describe certain kinds of imperialism or colonialism, as I see the post-colonial studies mostly doing, but not always. But I have my own weird definition here that I want to offer you. I think that post-colonial is a human condition that you cannot do anything about. For example, I am post-colonial because I come from two colonized nations, and I cannot undo that. As well as I'm post-socialist because I was born in the Soviet Union, so I cannot undo that even if I wanted to, right? So it's a condition, existential condition. But then the question is, what do you do with it afterwards? Do you take a decolonial option? And do you politically want to be decolonial? Do you want to decolonize whatever is more important for you? It may be ontology, it may be epistemology, it may be, politics, maybe anything. So that, for me, allows to reconcile maybe two things and say that let's not discuss further, who comes from where, from the British Empire, from the French Empire, from Latin America, but let's see what we share, because, of course, there are a lot of post-colonial scholars who think they are post-colonial and they call themselves that, but they are decolonial in the sense that they are very, very much active as decolonizers of various things, right? So it's really a very, very questionable division, I think, which we shouldn't continue using, I think. And then again, there is a whole former Second World that doesn't fit into any of these divisions, because when I started doing this, I was trying to understand what happens with people like me, who don't belong in the new Russian Federation because we are not ethnically Russian and we're still not second-hand citizens, second-rate citizens. And that's why I got interested in various global theories, let's say, and ways of thinking about it. And today's horrible war, Russian war in Ukraine, shows again that there are no instruments yet to describe this conflict, because you cannot just use post-colonial instruments. Of course, it is a post-colonial war in many sense, but it's not only that. And there are not enough, theoretical tools and epistemic tools, I think, yet to deal with that. And so that's why I think that both of these approaches are good, important, but they're also not enough. And what is important in decolonial option is that it always starts with the geopolitics and corpopolitics of knowledge, of being, of sensing, of gender, which means that we can't take theory created in one place and just automatically attach it to another situation. It has to grow there. It has to be formulated by people who are inside this conflict and who are suffering because of this historical and current traumas. So that, I think, is important, and that's why I'm very much interested now, for instance, in talking about the situation in Ukraine, what Ukrainian thinkers are coming up with, and they're amazing. I think they are actually already changing and enriching decolonial thinking with very interesting insights that before not known, or not heard, or not listened to. And of course, it's awful that the situation of war is creating this. But at the same time, I see it as a shift that is starting already. And I hope that we will hear more of those voices from the forgotten territories that after the end of the Cold War were labeled the void, the non-existent former socialist countries, including, of course, in Central Europe as well, in Eastern Europe, but also other places. So this is what I wanted to say, and maybe the last thing, I know that we don't have time, the last thing is that a lot of these kind of established studies within academia, some of which were mentioned in the introduction today, they operate with ready-made concepts, of course created in Euromodernity and by Euromodernity, right? And it's not that they are bad, but again, they describe a certain rather provincial situation pretending that it's universal, which is not true, right? So, it concerns things like nation state, democracy, independence, for example, institutions like the post-war created institutions like the UN and all that, that are becoming more and more bankrupt today and don't work, they're dysfunctional. So all of this also needs to be decolonized and delinked from, without assuming that this is how God created it, because we know that wasn't the case, right? So the people who created it in specific contexts and for reasons. So all of this needs to be also questioned, and it's a hard work, because that means that we have to question everything almost, right? Most of these pillars that our life is assumed or based on, but we need to do it because the world is in such a terrible crisis now, a complex crisis that needs to be also addressed in a complex way, and that's why it's very important to have events like that and networks like that. Thank you.
Wow,
thank you very much also for perfectly keeping with the time, but also I'm taking away quite a few questions for the discussion later, particularly about how we deconstruct also postcolonial theory again. So I think there's quite a bit to discuss later. Next, I would introduce Siddharth Tripathi very briefly, as most of you already know him, as he's a member of our network, based at the University of Erfurt. And Siddharth is going to talk about epistemic hierarchies.
Okay. Thank you, Tareq, and it's nice to see everyone here. So I mean, Madina has already sort of given a nice overview of things, and I'm going to pick up certain points from there and maybe problematize them more or flesh them out more, so that we can problematize even further in the question and answer round. But before that, I wanted to sort of give a brief background about myself and why it is important, so and what I struggle with, and I guess a lot of people who don't belong in a certain context or have moved from one place to the other, and why it is important for the debates that we are having today on postcolonialism and decoloniality and others. So I basically spent a lot of my time in India. That's where I was born, and born in a small place and moved to the capital to also do further studies in English language, because of course that would have improved my values, so to say, in terms of job market and others. Of course, my parents they don't know much about academia in that sense, so they still think that I'm studying, which we are all learning and whatever. So that was the first movement, from there. And then when I studied in Delhi, bachelor's, master's, and also did my PhD there, PhD in international relations, and from there then I moved to Germany a few years back, so ever since then I have been here. So that's a very short sort of, journey which I'm talking about. Now, why is it important? And I'm sure a lot of people here have similar journeys, similar struggles. So it basically sort of talks about, this notion of where do I belong, where do I come from in that sense, right? So it tries to navigate across these dualities and binaries, right? And when we talk about all the debates here, they basically are sort of working within the framework of this duality, dualism, and binaries. And there are people or scholars who actually do not know where, so for me the question is, am I a global south scholar based in the global north, right? Or am I now a global north scholar and who is also looking at global south, where I actually come from? So there is this dilemma, there is this struggle that sort of, I do speak English, which is still considered to be a privileged language, especially in India and so many other places, right? And so it really takes you far away from where you actually come from, right? So this question becomes important. Now when we talk about, and why it is important in the context of what we are discussing, in the context of hierarchies, is basically, it is not only about, when we talk about these whole discussions on post-colonialism and decoloniality, it is not only about inverting the hierarchy without touching this dualism, right, as Guha talks about. And so what happens is, unless we really touch upon this dualism and try to go beyond that, right, we'll always be talking about, say, this catchphrase Eurocentrism, and then try and create more binaries as such. Right, so we don't really get to the core of it. And when we talk about colonialism as such, it was exactly this. It was about negating the humanity of the others. So there was always us versus them, self and the other. Right, so there was this dualism which actually was at the core of it. And then until we really try and address that, I don't think we can really move beyond. Now, when I talk about this duality, there are 2-3 questions, very simple questions, like what exactly we are discussing. So, and then why and who talks about that, right? And then how do we move forward? But that is something which I can maybe discuss later. Now, when I talk about what, a lot of us have been conducting research in similar fields, and we know that, and a lot of scholars have also done that, where voices or sort of discussions, ideas from the global south, so to say, however we define it, have often been marginalized and also considered as less scientific or having less scientific rigor, as Susan Santos calls it, the epistemicide of the knowledges from the South. So that has been going on for a while now, right? So when we look at international relations as a discipline, I can talk about that because my training in India has been in that, and what was interesting for me was the IR that I did in India wasn't very different from the IR here, right? So it's not like, so why it's important is because you know how the predominance of these disciplines work. So it's not only about the North and the South, but also within the South that we try and, we might be doing the same, or we might be replicating the same hierarchies which we try and contest, right? So that is something which is important to look at when we talk about this question of what. And now, why? What is important? That the second question is about why. So when we talk about why, it's basically understanding the motivation of why we are doing what we are doing in terms of looking at one or oneself as such, and the one that we are investigating, right? So that's again the dualism between the subject and the object. I think yesterday Andreas also mentioned about reverting or reversing the gaze, or different ways of seeing, right? So it's not only us who are looking at certain things, but also how we are looked upon. So I guess this is very important, and it will be important to circumvent this perverse relationship that is constructed sort of within a broader structure, within broader hierarchies, and so and I bring in Sylvia Rivera's ideas, where she talks about that there's a need to circumvent this relationship that is constructed when the structure is, of course, indigenous resentment and non-indigenous guilt, right? So these are the two sort of ideas that she talks about. Now the third is who. So we are also part of that. We are also reproducing things, and how do we go beyond that duality? It's also trying to understand our own location, our own ideas, our own whitening processes, and how we have been part of that, or how we are product of that, right? So that is something which we have to sort of look at. There's been some research on reflexivity, on positionality, so that is something which becomes important in this context. What I've been working a bit on, how do we go beyond these binaries, north, south, self, other, you, me, There has been work by, especially I'm a big fan of Paulo Freire, and I remember I was reading Sylvia Rivera, and she said that, when I was thirsty, I used to go to Paulo Freire's work, and that's where my thirst was quenched in that sense, So he basically also talks about this whole division between I and you, and he says that the moment unless we really move beyond this binary or beyond this duality, we would not be really able to create really participatory sort of research or knowledge in that sense, and so he talked about dialogic practices, dialogic encounters, and in his famous book, of course, Pedagogy of Oppressed, and also Pedagogy of Hope, and so many others. So he basically also asks us to move beyond that, and not only limit ourselves to, say, academic discussions as such, or because we know, we try to claim that we are like really enlightened, but as we see it, I think the course of the discussions in the next couple of days, we're also sort of we'll also understand our own part and role in that. And Friday basically talks about knowledge in solidarity and for action. So he's basically saying that we also should understand that what we are producing might not be free from these hierarchies that we're trying to contest, because it's only limited to the academic world, it's only limited to say disciplines as such, and so that's why he calls about a more participatory action, so that knowledge should be produced in a certain context where this binary doesn't exist, or at least tries to contest these binaries. And he also talks about so dialogic encounters, and he says that instead of working on certain things like I'm working on Global South, I'm working on postcolonialism, or I'm working with, on scholar, on these different case studies. He says that one has to really work with people, in that sense, within academia, outside academia, within whatever locations you try to do. So he really changes that focus on solidarity, on allyship, and I think there's a lot for us to learn from feminist research. They have been doing that, and I mean, too bad for IR and maybe peace and conflict studies, we haven't really caught up to that, to what other disciplines have been doing. I mean, there is of course some movement, some in a good direction, so to say. So I would maybe just, I think I might have raised more questions than answers, but I mean, that's the whole point. But I want to end my sort of brief input on quoting Silvia Rivera, and I think that's something which I really, that touches my heart. So she says that, and I think Madina also made the point about this duality between post-colonial and decolonial. So what Silvia Rivera, she says that the post-colonial is a desire, the anti-colonial is a struggle, and the decolonial is a fashionable neologism. So I would stop there, and yeah, happy to take more questions on that.
Thank you, Siddharth. And also, don't worry about raising too many questions, because if I understood Madina correctly, we should be worried if we have too many answers, or think we have too many answers. So that's a great starting point for the discussion later. And now for the third import, we have Filiberto Penados, who is the co-founder of the Center for Engaged Learning Abroad in Belize and also at the University of Galen. And he will be talking about indigenous resistance and coloniality of development, if I'm correct. So you have the floor.
Right. Now I have two sets of notes, I don't know what I'm talking about. So you raised many questions, I'm going to create confusion. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this event. I'm really excited to be here and to learn from the conversation. I guess I'm going to mix these two sets of notes. Because I did come in to talk about coloniality of development and indigenous resistance, but I think the topic for this morning is a little bit different, so I want to see how I can combine these two things. Postcolonialism, decoloniality, there are different sort of similarities. I have to say that I'm not sure what the differences are, right? And maybe let me say something else then. I guess for me, in terms of approaching this, I've always approached it from the senses, how do I make sense of my own experience? Mm-hmm. Being a person from the global south, even though I've never thought of myself that way, but being an indigenous Maya person, but also of mixed ancestry, right? I mean, I have Spanish ancestry in my heritage. In a small little community, in a small little country, Belize caught between two empires, British and Spanish, actually, that came about as a result of the conflict with these two empires, quarreling about who has the right to exploit both land and people that land didn't belong to them. So that, I think, has been one of the motivations that has brought me to decoloniality. And then the other one is, how do we create an alternative future? I think that's the other question. So I guess it has been less of being sort of like a purist, if you want. I see a lot of similarities and common themes, and may draw things from different places, but I do get the sense that, when you talk about, when I understood post-coloniality, I was thinking, okay, so we're post-colonial, but if we're post-colonial, how comes I still continue to experience what I experience? That was kind of the question for me. So I did a different set of tools and a different language to speak and understand what it is that I'm experiencing, and how I might construct an alternative future. So that has been kind of the place from which I started. Along these lines, I remember completing a PhD and coming across Paulo Freire's work. And then I remember a Maori scholar talking about meeting Paulo Freire, and we spoke about, it's not that Paulo Freire taught me anything new, so to speak, without meaning to be arrogant, because Paulo Freire had lots to teach. But really that he provided me a language to understand my experience. Okay? And I find this kind of the same thing as I explore theory. So I haven't thought of myself as a theorist, I'm more of an activist scholar, right? I'm engaged. The point of, I guess, understanding the world is to change the thing. So kind of that, in that kind of way. And I remember doing a whole PhD and then not half of it, and then going back to Belize. And suddenly I was there with some knowledge, right? So people thought, and they engaged me. Right? They said, "Oh, you know, they were trying to establish an Indigenous education center." So they approached me and engaged me. Next thing I knew, I became involved in the Indigenous movement. And for the first time, as I encountered Maya brothers, I came across the Popol Vuh. Now, many of you have heard about the Popol Vuh, which is a Maya book, a creation story. The philosophy of the Maya people is encapsulated in that. And here I was, having completed a PhD, and never ever read the Popol Vuh. This is like really odd. And I began to read it, and in the beginning of the Popol Vuh says, in the beginning there was nothing, there was silence, and the creators came together to join their thoughts and their words. In other words, they came in order to create the world, in order to create human beings, they came together and joined their word and their thoughts. And I thought, I wasted my time doing a PhD and reading Paulo Freire, as good as he was. Here is dialogic pedagogy, right? If I had just read the Popol Vuh, I would have been fine. I wouldn't have had to do a PhD. I'm exaggerating, but you get the point, right? So you go through this whole process and you don't come across this whole heritage, this whole body of knowledge that has been silent and has been erased. Why is that? So that's something that I think I sought to understand. And so I've been trying to understand that. And I remember kind of growing up, I recently been working on a paper and I came to these two experiences, these two stories or teachings, I don't know what they would call it, that they would tell us growing up. One of them was, study so you can become someone. Okay? And the other one was, if you do not study, this land will be your punishment. Okay? Really, the way it was expressed was, si no estudias, ves toda esa tierra, esa va a ser tuya. All of this land will be yours. But really what it's saying is like, if you do not study, you see all of that land, that will be your punishment. So how did I come to be no one, okay? To be told, study so you can become someone. Also one question that was like in my mind, like, how did that come to be? Why is it that I feel this way? Why is it that I felt this way? And the other one is, how did land, which in the Yucatec conception, okay, land is yocolcab. Yocolcab means on top of honey, okay? And how did land then come to be a punishment instead of the source of honey, of nourishment, right? How did it come to be? And why would land be punishment? And in a sense, it's punishment because the only thing that I could envision was working the land, right? Being a servant to somebody else, so being exploited, or owning the land, okay, and producing something which I would then have to sell also to be exploited. So yes, land became punishment. So indeed, like, okay, if you do not study, land will be your punishment. But it was so different than the way that from my own ancestry, land would have been conceptualized and being human would have been conceptualized. And I think that experience can only be understood by looking at, by taking this decolonial sort of approach. So yes, Paulo Freire, Aníbal Quijano, Dussel, they're all kind of helpful in thinking through those things. Again, not so much that they're teaching something new without meaning to be arrogant, but providing a language, I think, for people who are from the Global South to be able to articulate and give expression and understand what it is that they are experiencing. I don't know, I'm not sure how long I've taken, but I want to stay within the 10 minutes.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, oh, okay, I'm doing great. Okay, so fantastic. So I wanted to also share a story, which is where I would have started, where I started with my notes here, that I think speaks to some of these issues. I remember at the conference I was asked, like, where does my decolonial or postcolonial thought is coming from? And I said, well, you know, I think it comes from Don Chayo. I don't know if you've ever heard about Don Chayo. And you probably haven't, right? Because it's my grandfather, okay? So I remember growing up, right, in this conversation with my grandfather, and for some reason this story has stuck. I've told this story many times, but you're a new audience, so I think it'll be okay for me to repeat myself. But he told a story that in the small community of Sokots in the western border of Belize, during the Second World War, a young man left from this town, which is today is about 2,500 people, so imagine there have been even less then, and came to Europe. Okay? Scotland, he thought, that this young man came to work in the agricultural fields. This shortage of labor because of the war that was going on. He spent a couple of months there and then went back home. Upon going back, Grandma was really excited about having her son come back. And so she decided to prepare something special for him. And what was more special, what could be more special than a particular kind of drink called pozol. Pozol is cooked corn, coarsely ground, mixed with honey. It's quite refreshing. It's served especially after men have been in the workplace out in the field. Okay. So this young man came back home and he served this bowl of pozol. Now, something to know about pozol is that it's a suspension. Right? So if you have to keep the mixture going, right? Otherwise, all the corn settles and you have all the water on top. We don't have spoons. Well, spoons were not used, so you kind of keep the mixture going. So when you take a gulp of it, you take both the corn and water with it, and that's how you enjoy it. So you really have to know how to drink this, okay? So, and especially it's served in a bowl that has it's a gourd, half of a gourd, which is a round bottom, right? So you cannot set it down. And so you drink it like this. You shake it and you drink it to keep the mixture going. So a young man is served this drink, right? And he starts shaking it and drinking it, okay? And after taking a few drinks, says, "Mom, this drink is so great, but what is the name of it?" And Mom is like, "Whoa." She's very dismayed, like, what's going on with this young man? What happened to him? What did they do to him up in Europe, in Scotland, okay? That he has forgotten the name of the drink. And, but suddenly she realizes that he is shaking it, right? And so she says, he might have forgotten the name of the drink, but at least he remembers how to shake it. So this story is multi-layered. It has different layers of meaning, and one can analyze it, right, in many different sort of ways. But I want to highlight two of them. One is like, why was this story being told? Okay, why is this story being told by grandfather to these kids? And within, I think the story, obviously it's being told for a reason. And essentially it was, do not be like this young man. Okay? Now, when we tell this story at home, everybody laughs because, of course, they know that it's not possible that this person who had been for 2 months to Scotland could have forgotten the name of the drink that he had been drinking all his life and that he particularly enjoyed. Okay? And that the shaking gives it away. Kind of this idea that you can take, back home they would say you can take the Indian out of the bush, right? But you cannot take the bush out of the Indian, right? So they kind of understand that. So in a sense, it's do not be like this person. That story, my granddad, who was in his 90s, born in the late 1900s, was constituted a decolonial act. It considered a decolonial act in the sense that it sought to undo those colonial hierarchies, okay? To disentangle our identity from that. But there's also a second teaching there, and that is that it doesn't matter how monolithic it might look, there is hope. There's hope because he still remembers how to shake it. Okay? And that's precisely what I think of when I think of indigenous resistance. Indigenous resistance is about shaking it, about rediscovering different ways of shaking it, of engaging in a process of rerooting and rerouting. So it's not like a going back, right? But actually rediscovering those roots to invent something new. And in that sense, being transmodern in the Dussel's kind of sense. I will leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I see a lot of synergies also with Siddharth's input, particularly in questions of identity and transition and trajectories of this. So this, I think, great groundwork for the discussion later on. I'm going to, as I said, briefly summarize some of the points that Sabelo sent around. I'm not going to take very long doing that. The printed version is also available for you. I've sent it in an email, as I said. And so Sabelo's thinking here was briefly 4 points I'm summarizing here. First of all, he was emphasizing a need to understand global cartographies of power. So essentially not think about global power in a binary, but think about multiple interlinked hierarchies here. Also think about a spatial dimension towards these hierarchies, so global cartographies of power, to disentangle that more, and to find a framework that better conceptualizes how these hierarchies actually play out. He also speaks about continuities and discontinuities, so sort of historically rooting these cartographies of power, with transitions from empires to modern nation states, from colonialism to postcolonialism, so the rootedness of these cartographies of powers, essentially. He draws also from his own fieldwork and research here to make a point that, in his experience, elites think of peace more in terms of negative peace, so the absence of violence, whereas ordinary people that he talked to and he interviewed would speak more of social harmony. So also when we think about like a very classical piece of conflict studies question, the one between negative and positive peace, to not just think of those as objective categories or analytical categories, but to think of them as socially rooted categories, where power relations determine which ones are applied and which ones are not applied, and these hierarchies play out there as well. And finally, building on that point, that we need to, first of all, name post-colonial conflicts, because the conflicts are not always in terms of violent conflicts, but they're often rooted in these hierarchies and cartographies of power. So we need to identify and name them to make them visible, and also to then build on that, to conceptualize them and to inform our thinking and research on that. There's also an addendum, which I wouldn't summarize because there's a lot of different dimensions of hierarchies that he summarizes there, but I would just encourage you to look into that yourself. It's a pretty good starting point, I think, when doing research, just trying to start thinking about hierarchies.